Hello, I'm David Schwartz. I'm the CTO at Ripple, co-creator of the XRP Ledger. I'm here with Aaron McDonald, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, Aaron McDonald, founder of Non-Fungible Labs and the Altered State Machine, and building the Futureverse.
So I guess let's start with the obvious stuff. So tell us what you guys are doing and why it's so interesting.
Yeah, so we've been working for a while now to figure out what is the ideal user experience for bringing people into Web3. And our teams have been building at different layers in the kind of protocol layer, come up with some interesting inventions there that we've worked on and had patented, in the application layer around wallet user experience, and more recently around the content space as funnels for users to come into Web3. And so all those little bits of stuff that people have been working on for the last 5 years, we tied together recently in a white paper called Enter the Futureverse. And the Futureverse as a concept is about bringing together what we'd call like the open metaverse operating system. So these different components that are necessary to drive safe user adoption for more users, an onboarding experience that feels familiar to them, and world-leading content experiences to draw them in. And so that's kind of a big project. There's a couple of hundred people working on this inside our ecosystem. You'll know some of the brands probably out there. The Non-Fungible Labs team produce Fluff World, which is this kind of universe of content that's interoperable. We have the Altered State Machine, who's built a protocol for embedding artificial intelligence in the metaverse through NFTs. And there's a whole host of things below the surface on that protocol layer that we've been working on, particularly the root network.
Well, so I guess that prompts the next question. What's the root network?
Yeah, so the root network, I think, it's a new approach to building out a layer one. And it's started from a design point of what is the user experience we'd like to give users when they come into Web3. If you look at like the landscape out there for lots of networks, they often started with how do we make Bitcoin or Ethereum faster and cheaper. And those are interesting scaling problems, and they're necessary problems to have people working on. But scaling in mass market adoption is much, much more than just faster and cheaper. And so if you think about kind of internet scale products out there, they spend a lot of time on what's that ideal onboarding experience? How do we reduce churn off when people are going through their sign up processes? How do we make sure that they have a safe user experience when they come in so they don't leave? And so we stepped back from what's faster and cheaper and said, what's the best user experience? And the team put together a bunch of protocols that we think deliver a superior user experience, and built those into the core of the network architecture. And so the root network is the underlying, substrate for these protocols to sit on, for the assets to exist inside of, for the data to exist inside of, that delivers that user experience that we want to deliver in the Futureverse white paper.
I noticed you mentioned user experience several times. And one of the points that I've been trying to make is that mass adoption depends on user experience.
Yeah.
Like early adoption, people are excited by the technology. And even if the experiences are terrible, they're so excited by the technology and what the technology can do that they'll tolerate them.
Yeah.
But I think as you well understand, if you're trying to drive for mass adoption, the user experience is so much more important than the technology.
Yeah, definitely. And you can see it show up in the numbers, right? So we have statistics out there, less than 5% of people who own cryptocurrency have engaged with DeFi. Like that's, of early adopters in the space, relative to the world's population, that's a relatively appalling stat. And so if we really care about Web3 and the open metaverse, then we have to care about user experience, because that's what's going to bring everyone in. And if we don't think bringing everyone in is important, then we don't really believe in Web3 and the open metaverse. It's all very well having, decentralized technologies that 5% of the world use, but that's not going to change anything.
So I kind of implied that technology is not important by saying that the user experience is more, but obviously you can't build great user experiences without great technology. I hope you'd agree with that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's just a different frame of thinking. So if you start with your reference point being user experience focused as opposed to technology focused, then you end up in a place where you design for that. And it's actually very hard to reverse out of that. If you start with a technology focus to solving a problem, I've heard arguments before, let's just focus on the protocols and the infrastructure and scale that, and then we'll think about user experience. What you find is that in order to deliver the user experience, you have to undo a lot of the things you thought you had right in the protocol and infrastructure side of things to deliver that. So while it's important and it's good that that stuff has happened, and we're building on the shoulders of giants who have paved this path, yourself included, have invented these amazing protocols. It was important to take that step back and say, okay, well, let's look at this with fresh eyes and think about the problem in a different frame.
So how long have you been working on metaverse type projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I've been in the Web3 space full time since 2016 and kind of playing a little bit before that, 2015. And my thesis from the beginning has been oriented around this. I come from a IT and telecommunications background and built some really successful products in that space. And when you're dealing with building products in that space that are genuinely, large scale, mass market product offerings, you tend to come into things with a different mindset, and you're thinking about all the parts of a customer journey, because it's a ruthless industry. If you don't get it right, they don't join or they don't stay. Pricing is compressed, so you don't have a lot of margin for error when you're building out the products and the value propositions for customers, and it's easy to switch. And so there's a lot of analogous customer behavior that I think will be important in this space as we scale up, that we felt was important to look at back then, because no one really was. And so right from the beginning, we had this idea of building scalable user experiences with different consumer funnels coming into it. Where we ended up was similar to that, except I missed the obvious point, which I should have not missed in the beginning. Instead of the funnels being driven by application experiences, consumer application experiences, they were going to driven by content. It always is. And I don't know why in my early kind of thinking, I didn't kind of have that in my first kind of thesis. But content drove the internet, and content's going to drive Web3, and the metaverse is the embodiment of that content idea.
So I think we all know how important standards, compliance, and openness was to the development of the early internet and even the internet today, and how some of the things that people don't like about the internet today are retreats from those commitments to interoperability and openness. I can't imagine that you don't think that interoperability and openness are critical to Web3 providing the kinds of great experiences that we want it to.
Yeah, no. I mean, again, this is another learnings from telecommunications. And there were, in the early days of telecommunications and the internet, there were protocol wars. And I used to spend a lot of time as an engineer with configuring equipment to mesh those different protocols into a network. And so everything that's old is new, and everything that's new is old. And we're in the same kind of phase, I think, with Web3, where there's these protocol wars going on, and eventually we get to a point of standardization, and standards become the driving factor of adoption. the standards movement is really early in Web3 relative to other industries, and if you peer behind the scenes of an international roaming call or something like that, it's a miracle that it happens, considering all the hoops that it has to go through, and the different equipment and the different standards behind the scene, and different data structures and all those kinds of things. But over time, that's become simpler and simpler and simpler as those as those protocols have become standardized around the world. That's a phase we have to go through for Web3, and it's okay that we have protocol wars now, but I think if we're really determined to make this successful on a world in an internet scale, we have to think about each other as working together to drive that outcome, as opposed to being adversaries. If we have that frame of mind, and we're all trying to approach the same outcome, but albeit from different points of view, then I think that we'd move a lot faster, and we'd scare fewer people off in coming into this space. And they take that to the next level. If you think about like the metaverse standards, that's even earlier. Everyone imagines Ready Player One as the metaverse experience, but we all know, if we're honest with ourselves, that the reality is that doesn't exist today in Web3, and getting there is very hard. And so there's a whole body of work going on that side of things as well, in terms of standards development that the Futureverse is involved with to get that user, or the content layer user experience, as well as that infrastructure layer of user experience to work.
Yeah, I think looking at the model of the way the internet grew, and protocol wars, and then standardization, and then to some extent what's happened more recently, where it's kind of split, we kind of lost some of that openness. I think it's instructive to compare that to what was going on in the Web3 space. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, I think, we're kind of standardization allowed for homogenization, but then that allowed for a situation where, in order to win, you had to have scale. I think part of that is because of the monetization model. And so in the kind of Web2 experience, you had to have enormous scale so you could farm the data, so you could sell ads. It only works at scale. It can't work in a micro scale. And also, the paradigm didn't allow for the economics of ownership, which we can have in Web3. And so the interesting thing about Web3 that can challenge that, even if we get to the standards being homogenized, because you could argue that once that happens, we get into the same problem that, super scale wins and everyone else dies, which is bad for decentralization. If we think about the economic layer, which is the thing that caused centralization in the internet, that's a different paradigm now, even if we have standardization at the infrastructure layer, because users now can own things, and instead of being trapped inside a wall and content driving that trap, users can move between different infrastructures. And so that economic freedom, because they have ownership of content and data and identity and those kinds of things, those are the things that should stop a repeat of the Web2 internet experience, where homogenization and standards led to scaling, but it also led to concentration. Should be able to avoid the concentration because that ownership model is different. We actually need to come up with a different name for content, because the notion of content is that's contained and it's held and it's owned inside of someone else's thing. But now we have this different thing which allows it to be open and free and interoperable.
There's a big difference between something that I own that I can put in my pocket and it goes wherever I go and is only subject to the rules that I impose on it, and say my ownership of a piece of real estate, right? Which is subject to the rules of an external system, and I have no control over that system. It's a very different, we call them both ownership, but they're very different in the way they behave and the experiences they create.
Yeah, totally, definitely. And that kind of notion of putting it in your pocket, I guess, is what Web3 is about, right? And so how do we create better systems for more people to engage with that in a safer way? And that's the mission of the Futureverse.
So An interesting attribute of that is this type of ownership as the type of ownership, like something that you can take out of a system and use where you want, and the connection to monetization, things that you can sell, things that you can buy. We've largely avoided that, the downsides of that in the Web 2 world. Like if you're very wealthy on Twitter, you're very poor on Twitter, it functions more or less the same. I mean, there's things that you can do with money, like you can advertise your account, but the basic experience is the same. And then in the gaming world, until recently, it was the same. The basic experience was the same. And we've seen games recently in the news like Diablo Immortal, which is your gaming experience is very different if you have a lot of disposable income in Diablo Immortal than it is if you don't have a lot of disposable income. And I think that makes the game maybe more fun for people who have a lot of disposable income and less fun for people who don't. I wonder if we're going to have those types of problems. You know, if you have a world where everything is monetizable, everything is for sale, everything can be bought and sold, your wealth is going to significantly affect your experience in that world. Is that what we want our entertainment to be like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, and I've never been a huge proponent of the concept of play to earn, for example, because it's kind of a false economy. I will say though that if we assume time is money, then there are lots of people in the gaming world who are extremely successful because they spend their time. And there are some that don't have the time because they choose to spend it on other things. Those other things often make them wealthy, and therefore they spend their wealth in different ways. So some people are wealthy in time, and some people are wealthy in money. Both of those can coexist if you think about the design of things correctly. A good community member, adjacent member of the ecosystem is a guy called Brooks, who is building Noor, which is a new kind of play-fi economy that I really kind of encourage anyone, if you haven't seen his Delphi podcast, get out there and Google it and have a look, because he goes through what game economies could look like that in this world when they're done right. But my last point would be, if we imagine the metaverse as this kind of evolution of our digital society into a more immersive digital society, then unfortunately society will probably transition into that, and there will be haves and haves not. The difference though is that wealth in the metaverse isn't constrained by access to resources in the same way that it is in the physical world. And so if you're a creator in that economy, you occupy quite a different position to the average creator in our traditional economy. And because goods don't require, access to, I don't know, minerals or, huge amounts of capital to produce, I think there's more opportunity for a fairer society, because the things we will value aren't constrained by physical boundaries or access to resources in the same way they are in the physical world.
So it could be to some extent an equalizer or leveler, depending on how the systems are built. But obviously the people who build them are going to be very tempted to try to extract as much wealth from their users as they possibly can.
There's always a Black Mirror episode of our imagined utopia, and it's an interesting exercise to go through as a product designer. Thinking about what's the Black Mirror episode version of the thing you're building. I always encouraged my product teams to think about that and try and work out, are there ways that we can build incentive models or structures to avoid those things.
Well, and I think also if you build a platform like Diablo Immortal, you may attract a small number of whales and get a lot of money for them, but there's a huge market of people who don't want to be in that world. That's not
interesting. And both of those are okay. They're both viable, experiences in the metaverse, and humans will gravitate to one or another or somewhere in the middle, and all of those things are okay. It's the same kind of black and whiteism that exists in these protocol wars. We have to think like a little bit grayer about things, I think, because that's how the world operates. Like, your view might be very strong that this is the right way. Cool, go have that view. Like, make that work, make that an economy, attract other people to you. If someone else has a different view and it works for them, cool for them too. Like, the world's a big place. We can all be successful and happy together. Let's not fight over things that don't actually matter.
And it does not have to be an or, right? It can be an and. Both types of worlds can exist. Sure.
It's always an and. Yeah.
Yep. So
There are
I
very
have to,
few things where it's not.
yeah. So I have to ask you, what do you like about the XRP ledger?
Well, I think when I first started looking into it, I was quite surprised because there's quite a bit of rhetoric out there, and if you only investigate things at that level, you might be misled in terms of what's actually being built. I think it was a very clever solution to solving the energy problem and performance problem of proof of work before proof of stake really became a thing, and and the architecture of it in some ways is if you implement it as the protocol was designed, is possibly more decentralized than proof of stake, because users get to choose the validators that they want to listen to in a way that isn't forecast in the minds of proof of stake networks. And so you can have this kind of layers of decentralization within the network, that aren't available in other architectures, which I thought was really interesting.
I think that's very relevant to Web3 use cases too. If you think about proof of work, like you have automatic stakeholders that are the people who can provide the proof of work. Like
Yeah,
you can't act against their interests. They're not gods. They don't run the system, but you can't neglect their interests. And like
yeah,
you see in Ethereum's transition to proof of stake, that miners, or some of them are saying like, well, we don't want that transition because they're going to lose revenue, and they want fees to be high because they get to keep those fees. And in proof of stake, so there are certainly advantages of proof of stake, like the reduced energy consumption, but you still have a group of stakeholders that are people who hold a lot of the native token.
yeah.
You can use Ethereum for some interesting application like NFTs, and you may not care about Ether, its native token. You may not. There's no correlation between those two. And so in a proof of stake system, you're not necessarily a stakeholder merely because you use Ethereum as a sort of global computer. The
Mm,
stakeholders will become the people who hold the native token. The
mm,
approach that we took in the XRP ledger tries to make the stakeholders the people who actually transact on the ledger.
yeah,
So it's not, electrical power that gives you authority. It's not holding the native token XRP that gives you authority. It's the fact that you're a participant in the ecosystem. It's the economic value that your transactions bring, whether or not, like, we built it as a multi-token ledger. You don't have to use XR, you have to pay transaction fees, but they're, a tiny fraction of a penny. So we don't force you to participate in the ecosystem in ways that you don't want to. And we don't sort of take away your voice and governance because
mm,
you don't hold the native token or
yeah,
because you don't have a lot of electrical power ASICs.
yeah. Yeah, and I think this kind of idea of centralization versus decentralization was rooted in the notion of the foundation and the nodes that the foundation kind of deems as important. And I think if you can adjust your frame of reference and think of those as nodes that people have investigated and think have high performance and recommend you use versus nodes you have to use, then it changes the picture entirely. Those foundation nodes then start to look a lot more like what Infura does for Ethereum than anything else. And if we take a look at what happened quite recently with Infura and Tornado Cash, we can start to see how decentralized that actually is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the XRP ledger has been around since, 2012 or so. So it has kind of stood the test of time in a way that, some of the newer technologies haven't. And I think shaking out problems, especially if you're going to trust it with very, very high value applications that are attack and theft targets,
And
one of the,
all of this is to say that, like, and the same argument applies to the GameFi conversation we had, is that there's room for more. It's an and question. Some networks and network architecture are good for some things, and the security model on those networks are good for some things, and the contract execution environments are good for some things, and some are good for other things. There isn't a
right.
one slice of the cake that fits all use cases. That's not how networks work. We don't have TCP/IP in the ear for our mobile network communications because it's not an effective type of network topology for mobile networks. We use 5G or 3G or 4G as a communications method in that protocol layer, because that's an optimal type of communication for that type of network. And so we have to think about the internet of blockchains in the same way. There are different protocols that suit different kinds of use cases, and that's cool. And let's try and make them work together as much as we possibly can.
It's kind of crazy to try to use the exact same blockchain and the same sort of platform for somebody who wants to, give out 20,000 NFTs to everybody who comes to, download a video versus somebody who wants to have, an NFT that represents a single fine work of art that's like an irreplaceable, Mona Lisa kind of. It doesn't make sense, right?
They're
Those
different
applications
security
have
models,
different.
they're different storage models, they're different, user experience models. So yeah, we have to think about application-specific architectures.
And can we keep them interoperable?
We have
Even
to
if they're
keep them
that different?
interoperable. I mean, that's one of the things about the root network, right? So out of the box, we're going to be interoperable with Ethereum and XRPL, and we're going to do that in an interesting way. And the architecture allows us to expand that to other networks as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are people who want NFTs on Ethereum, and there are people who don't want to spend $10 for a transaction.
Yeah,
Or they
totally.
need fee stability or
Or
volume.
they've just chosen, that their tribe is XRP, and that's cool. Well, let's give them superpowers too, so they can do all sorts of cool things. That's the opportunity here, is to say, people have chosen that tribe for whatever reason. You don't agree with them, cool, that's fine. You chose a different thing, that's also fine. The goal is to give both those users the ability to have a great user experience interacting with the open metaverse, to give those assets that they hold on each one of those things superpowers, so they can come and do more things and be more useful. It's only a win-win.
We got a question in the chat about XRPL NFTs versus ETH NFTs. What's the difference? Are they the same or better? So I think you and I would both answer that question a little bit differently. So I'll tell you the answer that I would give, and then I think you're going to answer it from the other side. So the answer that I would give is that, so Ethereum, you have a high transaction fee. So you're not going to put an NFT on Ethereum if it isn't something of very high value. It just doesn't make sense, right? Whereas on the XRP ledger, you could create an NFT for a very, very small amount, tiny fraction of a penny. So it could be a lower value item. It could be something where the value is more in like a large collection of things. And another difference is that the XRP ledger has a set of fixed functions, while Ethereum has a smart contract. And so there's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage on the Ethereum side is that you can have very powerful functionality around the NFT that the XRP ledger can't quite do. Like, you could have some very complex model of who owns it and when and how it gets transferred and who gets reserves. Whereas with XRP ledger, you have a fixed set of functions. But the downside of that is, if you don't know the exact behavior of the smart contract, you don't know what that behavior is. It can have very complex behavior and you don't know what it is. And I think we've seen thefts where people have been tricked to authorize smart contracts where they didn't know what that smart contract did. You can't have that flaw or that vulnerability on the XRP ledger because it doesn't have smart contracts that have that kind of power. So there's advantages and disadvantages of both, depending on what you're trying to do. I would say if it's a very high value thing with a small number, or you need very complex functionality, Ethereum might be a better choice. If you want ease of transfer, high speed, low cost, and you don't need it to trigger complex behavior in a smart contract, then the XRP ledger is probably a better choice. Yeah,
I think that's a fair summary. And I'm going to split it down the middle by saying the root network is trying to do the best of both. So we were taking the approach that there is an NFT runtime in the network that has that standardization of functions and features, and if you use that, you'll be able to transact with the NFT ecosystem that's built on top of that in a uniform way. And we have smart contracts, and so if you want to do something super special that was not like intended in the original design of the runtime, you can add that functionality on top of it. I think the other thing both XRPL and Root Network have as a benefit is standardization. When we talk about this next layer of interoperability at the metaverse layer, ERC, the ERC process produces a level of standardization, which is useful. But it doesn't go far enough, I think, in order to have the asset layer as a standardized thing for applications. And so I think we have the opportunity with these more kind of defined network behaviors to increase the ability for interoperability to happen, because the data structures are similar every time. Our CEO, Brad Garlinghouse, likes to say the power of and versus the tyranny of or whenever someone tries to force him to make a choice that he doesn't feel like he needs to make. We're just about out of time. Anything you want to say, Aaron, before we have to go? No, it was a great chat. Thanks, everyone, for having us on. check us out on Twitter if you want to follow up on some questions, or find the Futureverse white paper at futureverse.com.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting us.